There's often lots of confusion that people have about why they feel the way they do sexually,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of delicate kind of negotiating with
Mm-hmm.
your partner. And so I think the model really does help free people up to things and then follow up and ask these inner questions to find out why parts are interfering or why their proclivities are what they are. Yeah, I think it's very useful that way.
Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self-Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. Hello, curious people, and welcome to season 2 of the Self-Led in Bed podcast. I had a great time recording season 1, and I am so excited to dive into this next chapter and to continue this journey to find and befriend sexual parts, to clear individual and collective burdens, and to embody our authentic sexual selves. I have some amazing guests lined up who are going to bring their wisdom to this conversation during this season, starting with today's episode, where I am so honored to host Dr. Richard Schwartz, also known as Dick, who is the founder of Internal Family Systems. I have learned so much from Dick over the last decade plus, but today was a unique opportunity for the two of us to have a focused, uninterrupted talk about sex through the lens of IFS. Dick shared lots of personal and professional stories, and we fleshed out lots of ways that IFS can be a transformative tool for navigating the complexities of sexuality in today's world. Please be aware that this episode contains topics related to sexual activity, anatomy, and abuse, and listener discretion is advised. Dr. Schwartz has authored numerous books, including No Bad Parts, and has trained thousands of therapists worldwide in the IFS model. His work emphasizes the inherent value of all parts and the healing power of self-energy. Dick lives with his wife, Jean, near Chicago, close to his 3 daughters and his growing number of grandchildren. Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Dick. I am so honored that you're here on the Self-Led in Bed podcast. It's been a new endeavor for me, and to have you here as a guest when your work has inspired like so much of what this is about is just such a great opportunity. So I'm excited to talk with you.
Congratulations on the new podcast, and I always valued your contributions to the IFS library and community. Happy to be
Great.
here.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's been a long journey, really. And when I always feel like I want to mention this when I talk with you, which is that in the very early days of my training, I did my family therapy training in Chicago at the Institute for Juvenile Research. And I think you maybe gave a guest lecture one day. It was, you were there at the time on faculty, and we were studying the meta frameworks
What year was
model.
that, really?
I think that was around 91, 92 in
I
there.
had just left, yeah. So they probably pulled me in for a lecture.
Okay. Yeah. And I had already gotten very excited about systems thinking and family systems. And then it took a bit to later re-encounter IFS
Mhm.
and fit it into the mix. I was already a sex therapist when I really studied it in earnest. But it was such an amazing way, as with so many areas, as people are discovering, to just really help people approach things that were maybe more abstract for themselves, theorizing maybe about sexuality can be such a black box for people. Why do I feel this way? Why is my body doing this thing? What's wrong with me? I've done too much of this, I'm not enough of that. And to be able to have this tool to help people really turn toward that and have a safe way to explore it has been just really revolutionized any kind of approach I was using before.
I'm really glad to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was wondering, I guess first off, do you want to just share with listeners where you are in the world right now?
I'm at home, which is outside of Chicago and the North Shore, and I have a kind of respite between trips. I leave in about, what's today, Friday? No, today,
Thursday. Today's Thursday.
about a week and a half for the psychedelics conference in Denver. Yeah, otherwise I'm just hanging around the house.
All right. Do you notice any parts that are here as we step into this conversation?
About sexuality?
Yeah.
No, I like the topic. I have written about it some years ago and it's really important. I don't have any fears about talking about it.
Okay. That's great. And I was actually going to ask you that also. Like, I know you've written, you had a great article back in, I think it was 2003. Am I right? Was it that long ago? In the Networker, the Psychotherapy Networker. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about your work as it relates to sexuality over the years.
Oh,
This is big, that's big, but
it's hard for me to remember that article. Along the lines of how you introduced this, it's a really delicate area, and there's often lots of confusion that people have about why they feel the way they do sexually,
Mhm,
and a lot of delicate kind of negotiating with
mhm.
your partner. And so I think the model really does help free people up to things and then follow up and ask these inner questions to find out why parts are interfering or why their proclivities are what they are. Yeah, I think it's very useful that way.
Yeah. And I love that you're really going right to that relational aspect too. Because I know with sexuality, it can bring in, there's so many things like people may have more experience working with sexual abuse or sexual trauma than working with kind of everyday sexual dilemmas that people face. And I know you've done a ton of work around sexual trauma and you've worked with sexual perpetrators. So there's that end of the spectrum where people have really been deeply harmed and carry wounds around that or and perhaps harmed others and still have wounds around that. And then there's this whole other range, which is even just being in the world that we're living in right now too. I think there's so many mixed messages and so much to sort out. And whether that's as an individual, even just who am I as a sexual being in my own skin walking around in the world, and how do I carry myself? Who am I attracted to? All of that. And then when you bring in relationships, whether that's couples or open kinds of relationship structures or whatever they are, you're dealing with a whole nother system and or multiple systems. Yeah.
Yeah, as you're mentioning it, especially these days, the topic of sexual identity has become incredibly complicated. And I've worked with not a lot, but a few people who've used the model to try and sort all that out. And it's
Mhm.
fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was curious when you work with people around sexuality, and I don't know how much that's a part of your current work. Actually, do you want to say anything about how you might, in more recent years, how this might enter your work? I know you're doing some different kinds of things now.
As you said, my focus was abuse for a long time and people survivors of it. And
Mhm.
there was a lot about helping people reclaim their sexuality that and to even have work with the parts that would allow them to feel sexual again. And so that was the main thrust of my work for years in regards to sexuality. And then would have a few clients that had other kinds of issues with it, but it was mainly that. And last several years, I just haven't been seeing clients ongoingly,
Yeah,
consults that might go in those directions. But
yeah. Okay. I've been working in the field of sexuality for quite a long time and have worked with people with so many different kinds of dilemmas. And one of the ways the model has been really useful to me, there's many ways, but this sense that sexuality is a powerful resource in the system and that parts might use that to do their jobs. So when we're looking particularly at the protective system, that there's ways that our manager parts can take on all sorts of roles to either to protect the system, to prevent the exiles from being triggered. And those might be roles to either further sexuality, like to use sexuality and bring it on. And they also might be parts that are putting up lots of stop signs and no ways.
Mhm. Yeah, I've worked with clients who let's get it over with and let me be in control and would use sexuality to control the other person. And then also would have parts that really kept them from feeling much of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, I was just remembering that recently I did a podcast with a guy named Eamon Armstrong, and it was on kink and S&M. And I came into it saying, I have nothing to say about any of this. So I don't know why you asked me. And
Uh-huh.
by the end, it was really fascinating. It was really so.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything you specifically remembering from that stood out to you?
One of the, it was Eamon and his co-moderator, whose name I can't remember. And they each agreed to let me do a piece of work with them. And along the lines of what we've been talking about, Eamon was more into the kink, I think, and was always in a certain role, a caretaker role. And so we just went inside and he was interested in his parts and what they thought of that. And we got to this exile who said, I don't like it. I don't want you to keep doing it. And that was a very interesting point because a lot of the criticism of people that are into that is that if they really healed, they wouldn't do it anymore. And the community is very sensitive about that, which I can understand. And of course, the part that liked the practice didn't want to give it up and was very upset to hear that this one was feeling
Mm.
the way it felt. And so we worked something out and it all worked out. And he, as far as I know, is still doing it.
They made some kind of agreement around it, or maybe some kind of boundary or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
little one who was so adamant in the beginning shifted and said, okay, in these conditions, it's fine.
Yeah. I love that. It's a great example. Yeah. And I do, like you were saying, oh my gosh, the outer world, there's so many different things going on, right? So on the one hand, there's, I think, more and more accessibility of these creative spaces for people whose systems are allowing them to step in to really be in community around sexuality, whether it's in like kink spaces or just all different kinds of exploratory tantric spaces and polyamory. So there's opportunities to explore, and I think lots of different parts can come out. There's could be a lot of play and creativity and creative embodiment and all that stuff. And at the same time, if there's not, this is one of the things I love about helping people feel that they have more access to self energy, to feel self-led in bed, because it's a really different proposition when there's some self in the room. So that if the choices feel like choices, and that what I call internal consent can happen prior to even alongside perhaps the kinds of negotiation that might happen with other partners. And it's a really different experience, I think, with some self energy there than when it's not.
It's different with self energy there, and it's different when self is checked in with all the parts to see if it's okay with everybody and got everybody on board. And I'm just afraid too often a firefighter makes a strong case for why this is great for the person.
Yeah.
There's other parts in the dust.
And that's when people may run into more backlash, things like that. And of course, that can happen in any area. Like it's not only in those spaces that can happen in a monogamous relation. It could happen in a long-term relationship that or even by oneself, people can engage in sexual behavior as an individual, whether it's self-pleasure with or without pornography, or there's just different fantasy, even around fantasizing, there can be parts that get very polarized about whether to let in a particular fantasy. No, you can't think about that. You're in carpool with that person. Like you can't, or whoever, whatever it is, there could be like a negotiation that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
And parts I find too that sometimes it's not like that easy to find a turn on that really rings the bell. And so when the system has found something like that, which sometimes I call those U-turn ons, that when a system has found something like that, like there's a lot of protection around it. Like to your point with the kink story, hey, this is the thing that gets us over the hill here. Don't give that up. Don't go near that. We don't want it to lose its charge. And maybe there's other parts that are horrified at what that particular thing is, or they're tired of it, or it goes against, I'm a feminist. How could I be fantasizing about
Yeah.
some kind of dominant rape scene or something like that? It's stuff
Yeah.
that could cause a lot of dissonance. Sorry.
That polarization between protectors, I find to be a lot easier to reconcile. It's more, as was true for Aemon, when you get to the exile and the exile isn't liking it,
Mm.
a bit harder. But yeah, both because of religious backgrounds and cultural, like feminism and so on, there's often a lot of judgment about the sexual part. And a lot of times just going to both sides and connecting with them and having them come and talk together works all that out. You can heal the exile, find out where it's stuck in the past, and
Yeah.
triggered by it maybe.
So if we talk about exiles for a minute, these sexual exiles, there's of course so much context that would go into each person's situation. I guess for maybe listeners who are newer to IFS, so I want to say in the end, we would always want to ask the particular part, right? If we're working with someone in their system or someone's looking at their own parts, we'd always want to ask each part what's true for it, right? But that there can be a lot of different kinds of burdens that exiles carry related to sexuality. And some of them are specifically sexual in nature. If they were shamed in some way for touching their body, or maybe around potty training, or things related to something related to their body or their sexuality. And then there's the things that are the larger burdens in the system, generally just not feeling like you're invisible or you're dirty or disgusting in some way. So the level of the different kinds of burdens that come out, I guess I was curious in if you had any observations or comments about that. If, I guess more specifically, it almost feels like sexual burdens are even like extra heavy a lot of times.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, if you were sexualized as a child, even if there wasn't active abuse,
Mhm.
it'll still have a big impact on how you are sexually as an adult. And there's often a big polarization between the parts that are afraid if you express your sexuality that you're going to be hurt, and the parts that feel the sexuality and want. And so there's a lot to negotiate between those sets of parts.
Yeah. And I think you were starting to mention earlier legacy burdens. I think that there's so much legacy around this stuff because how we're raised as kids is it's in the air, right? Like how the family attitude might be toward sex and being in a body and how that's regarded. And so I think it can be mystifying sometimes, even like where do I begin when there's just a sense of, for instance, just that it's really bad or wrong. Sometimes people can trace it to particular teachings, but sometimes it's more just, I think, in the air.
Yeah, I had a client who was very Catholic and came in because he was obsessed, because apparently in the Catholic Church, there's this belief that if you entertain a sexual thought for over some period of time, I forget how many minutes in your mind, that's a big sin, a mortal sin maybe. And so the sexual part would start giving him these sexual thoughts, and he would be looking at his watch constantly to see how soon it was going to turn into a sin. And I didn't know much about that, the Catholic Church. I couldn't believe that was true. So I had a friend who was a Catholic priest, and so I took my client to hear from the priest that wasn't true, but he said, no, that's true.
Oh boy.
But that's an example of,
So it's a larger collective, and we would call that a legacy burden, but that's a value, right? That's something that not everyone would call a burden. Some people would call it's teaching, that it's a truth.
yeah, but it's a burden.
Yeah. So there's a good question, right? Because what about that? A lot of people have been through purity culture, come from
And
some people have left communities that are high control type religions where there is a lot of really direct prohibition around sexual behavior. And some people are still at home in those kinds of communities, but trying to incorporate some change in their sexual life. And so I think this question of personal values and like where does the culture begin and end? Yeah, I guess I'm just intrigued with that. I guess I have a part who always wants to be very attentive to cultural bias and knowing that there's gifts as well as burdens in these different traditions, but then also seeing how people can really suffer in their relationship to sexuality with a lot of these messages.
yeah, my evaluation of any culture or any religion is how they encourage you or don't to relate to your parts. And I have this kind of all parts are valuable, all parts are welcome attitude. So anything that's going to shame you for having any kind of part is not not good in my religion.
Yeah.
So I take a stronger stand, not such a beliefs are valuable stand.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be a real conflict inside of people's own systems. Like I find a sense of belonging and identity in here, but also it's caused me to really disconnect from my body and to feel oodles of shame.
Yeah, I work with lots of religious people, or have in the past,
Mhm.
where the consequence of giving up their beliefs was pretty severe. And I could understand why they wouldn't. And it was still a big constraint in terms of what we could do in their inner system.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you may be aware that I've been running these groups for therapists. I call them bliss groups to help people behold and lead their internal sexual systems. And I have a strong belief that it's really important that as people who hold space for others, that we can have some level of familiarity with our own parts around sex and sexuality, like for lots of reasons. And in the course of it, I've been able to do demos and just have the privilege of getting to know a lot of people's systems in this sort of shorter period of time. And there've been a lot of people who've come in with these kinds of challenges coming from these very strict religious backgrounds. And it's been really moving how much healing can happen by the group being in a group setting, which is often we're not often talking about sexuality in a group setting, especially one that's professional in nature. I remember one person I do like a guided body scan where people just spend time with and really listen and befriend the different parts of their body, including their erogenous zones and finding the parts, because there's lots of parts that can show up both
Mm.
in terms of allowing attentiveness even to one's own body, and then also the parts that live in the body and the body parts themselves. And but I remember one person who just said that being led through that, I felt like you just blessed my penis. Like he had come through like with so much shame and sinfulness that like any awareness he had of his penis was shameful, and everything he did with it was shameful. And just the idea of bringing kindness and curiosity and presence was profoundly healing for him.
Yeah, I can totally appreciate the power of a group experience like that. And just the language of parts frees people up also.
Yeah, yeah. And it really is interesting, like how exiled our sexual parts are. And I think whether we're therapists or not therapists, that can be the case, but I'm particularly tuned into therapists. And I was going to say, because if we're going to hold space where our clients can speak freely and comfortably with us, or it's going to be a lot harder for us to hold that space if we haven't looked at that.
Yeah. You can only be with your clients in self when they're working with certain parts, if you can be with those parts in yourself. And
Yeah.
doing, especially around sexuality, be very comfortable with your own is key, I think, for a therapist.
Absolutely. And another reason I think that's important is that these parts can sneak up on us because often there's a lot of exiled stuff. And so if a client is perhaps has what some people would call transference, or has some kind of something about how they look or how they talk or the things they say to us elicit some unmet need in us, like that's where I think people can sometimes get into trouble. And I think those sexual parts catch people off guard because there can be so much surprise and shame when they pop up. So again, just saying, yeah, everyone has sexual parts, and our bodies can react to other people and things that they say, and that doesn't mean you're a bad person. And our parts can have fantasies and all those things, but if we don't know what they are and we don't have a relationship with those parts and we're not able to negotiate with those parts, I think the small number of people I think who do get into ethical problems, I think it's often without having had the support maybe or the opportunity to really turn toward and form strong relationships with their own parts.
Yeah, and also not having outlets in their lives for those parts.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
the other thing I found was I worked for a while with sex offenders and pedophiles, and often the part that was wanting to hurt vulnerable kids would team up with the sexual part because it knew that the sexual part could throw a coup. If he could generate enough sexual energy, then the one who wanted to hurt kids could take over.
Mm.
I don't know if you found that, but
Mm.
that was interesting.
Yeah. I'm curious when you say the sexual part that I'm curious about that. Like what
Just the
it,
part that carried a lot of sexual energy.
uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily attracted to kids, but was being used by this other one.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. 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 I think that power is a big piece that comes into play here too. Just the dynamics of power and powerlessness.
Yeah, and that when I would work, I consulted to this treatment center for sex offenders for a couple of years. And when I would work with those parts, the ones that wanted to dominate little kids and ask where they were stuck in the past, the client would see scenes from being abused themselves as a boy and having no power. The part said, he would look around the room and say, who has power in this room? It's this guy doing this to me. I'm going to take in his energy to protect my person from him, and then get stuck with that legacy burden, then has this drive to dominate and so on. And then we'll
Yeah.
team up with the sexual part to throw a coup.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's the people who have had more intense experiences of that. And then, like you said, may become sexual perpetrators. I have tremendous compassion for people who have attraction. There's like minor attracted adults who don't ever act on that and have to be so mindful their whole lives about this attraction that they have that there's no safe outlet for. There's a lot of permutations.
Have you ever worked with those people with IFS?
I have not personally. I've more been privy to hearing people in the sex therapy field talking about their work that way. I have worked with people who have there's an impossible attraction. There's at least a part in the system, and that could be someone who's committed to a monogamous marriage, having an attraction to one or more people that are not their spouse. Or it could be there's a million scenarios. There's an impossibility to something, and then there are parts that don't want the person to even know that they have that attraction because it is so distressing to them that then it gets more polarized. So I find that often just if the protectors could allow the person or the self to witness and be with parts that have whatever kinds of sexual feelings and attractions that they have and really be with that. That in itself can really open up a lot of more relaxation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, especially with the guys I worked with, the more they would exile or try to exile that sexual part that wanted kids or wanted something taboo, the more it looked for opportunities to totally take over. And the more, and it became a vicious cycle that way, because then they'd get more and more afraid and more committed to locking it up. And
Yeah.
moments of weakness, it would break out and take over.
Yeah.
That's what you want to depolarize by helping the person go to the part and not just accepting it, but also maybe in some cases anyway, seeing where it's stuck in the past and where it got its proclivity.
And I feel like that piece, and again, whether it's with people who are in that zone of perpetration or people of any kind of really sexual trauma or that they're working with, it can take a lot of courage, the courage of self to really allow a witnessing of that exile. It can be so utterly
Shameful. Yeah.
painful, so destabilizing. And one thing that I've really come to see over and over again is that we can't, I can't predict what the actual wound is. It might seem obvious. There was sexual abuse, the sexual act or whatever, but I think it's in any scenario, I think it's so important just to witness with an open mind. But I can't predict what the wound actually is. The wound might be the breakup when an adult decided they were no longer going to engage in sexual behavior, but it was the abandonment. It could be not that there's can only be one burden, but like I just think around sexuality, we can bring a lot of judgment, a lot of preconceived notions, and have a lot of boxes and compartments. And so it can be really a challenge for the client system, for the therapist system to open the space enough to just, gosh, what happened for you? Where are you in this? What hurts you about this?
Yeah. And that's some of the what I love most about IFS is you never know it's where it's going to take you.
Yeah.
That sort of exploratory spirit that we have.
Yeah. 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 So we're talking about some of these internalized burdens and legacy burdens, and I wonder if we turn to just considering the outer world for a minute. And as a multi-systemic, well-trained meta frameworks therapist, I always want to look at all the different levels of the system. That we're certainly in a world where not everyone's sexuality is safe. It's not safe to be or express one's sexual orientation or gender identity or express yourself visibly in many parts of the world. And in our country, we're seeing a lot of really intense repression and things moving not in a good direction with that. And I'm just wondering, in an environment, whether it's, and you've talked about this around racism and other things, when you're in when the outer world is giving you a lot of messages that it's not safe to be who you are, or that it's wrong morally to be who you are or to want what you want, how do you help the person to feel secure in their sexuality?
It's much more challenging, and the world has become much more challenging in that realm. And so when people are bombarded by messages that it's not safe to be who they are, we can still usually go to exiles and help them, the exiles that take in the messages of shame or reacts so strongly to the potential of fear, and help people heal those parts, even though their protectors don't necessarily stop protecting, because it is a dangerous environment. That allows people to be more self-led in the outside world, and when they have those C words, then they can navigate a lot better constant explosions. It's not going to change the outside world necessarily, but we can help people manage a lot better.
Yeah. So then Right. So if at least in the inner world, there's a more of a sense of calm and connection, there's more resilience perhaps or courage in the,
Yeah, and if in the inner world, these parts that feel so judged get this acceptance from self and love from self, then they don't worry so much about what the outer world feels,
yeah,
which is easier to do with judgment. It's a little harder to do with safety.
yeah. It's a very real thing. And even in terms of inviting people on this podcast, I know there's people that are much more reluctant to be visible and talking about their gender identity and expression than would have been the case a year ago. And
Mm.
I just want to send a lot of, I don't know, just witnessing, I guess, out to people who are in a lot of pain about this right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the analogy I would make is to we work with Black people, we work with Jews now that anti-Semitism is so strong. And again, it's true. All of that is true, that there are these very negative, destructive legacy burdens in our culture. And it really helps like to not have that legacy burden of Holocaust survivor go off every time you encounter one. So just translating that to sexuality.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm sitting here debating whether to share something, but of course, I guess I will because I've gone this far. But just as a Jewish person, I'm pretty tuned into the Jewish Holocaust experience. But I had a pretty powerful experience at the IFS conference one year before I presented. It may have been the first time I was presenting there, and I was the night before, I was agitated and I had a person, my roommate, who's a friend and a really powerful healer. And she sat with me and I was going inside to find what was there. And I can't remember all the permutations of how we got there, but I got to a place where all these, the queer people with the pink triangles, so many of whom were put to death in the Holocaust, were like showing up and it was like a healing experience where these parts were able to find a portal and to rise. It was one of those just very unexpected healing kinds of experiences where it just felt like there was some sort of presence of this like stuck souls and that
Lost souls, you help to
these
move.
lost souls and they were able to move on. It was very emotional and probably harkens whatever things in my own history and family history too. But yeah.
That level of legacy unburdening is one of my big interests now,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and involving ancestors and yeah.
Yeah. Just legacies around all these different kinds of wounds and things that the culture just has a hard time with. And I like to say I have a part who's always wanting to balance this story here because I know we're getting into some of the kind of harder aspects of things. And I do want to talk about self energy and sort of the way that I feel like sexuality can be a really important way of renewing ourselves and a reset personally, a reset in a relationship, a way that people can engage in self care and just have some joy and pleasure in their lives. And as we're talking, I just want to open that up. I don't know if you have any thoughts or feelings about the positive, nourishing aspects of sexuality.
Yeah, my wife Jean has a lot of friends who don't have sex anymore in their relationships,
Mhm.
and I'm at that age where I think that's true for a lot of people, and I don't know all the factors involved. I know testosterone levels drop and so on, and bodies don't look as attractive anymore and so on. But it just feels like a shame because that the intimacy that comes with sexual experiences, for me, a huge part of relationship. So that you're just walking away from that seems tragic.
Yeah. And people can be so all over the map with that. For some people, there's sort of retirement. I'm done with that. Like
Yeah.
I don't feel the urge. I don't need it. And if you're with a partner for whom that is similar, that might work out just fine. But if it's A, not mutual, or B, people are giving up on it without knowing that there's a lot of ways to retool oneself or reframe. A lot of what I do with people of any age is really pausing a minute to say, what is sex to you? And what constitutes a sexual relationship? And that doesn't have to be defined by any particular body part or sexual activity as I see it. And that sometimes as people are getting older, it's a matter of let's be creative and what do we value about this? And maybe we don't do it the way we used to do it. And maybe it takes 3 times as long. And maybe we need more time before we do it again. But that there's a lot of ways to,
Orgasms are involved, yeah.
yeah, may not be involved or not as often, but there's actually a lot of discovery also that I think people can do as they get older, where maybe the old script that was perhaps unquestioned isn't working anymore. And then that can bring in more like creativity and discovering sensation, maybe a more whole body experience of sensuality than what was experienced before.
I get the relief it is for some people to not have to bother with it and think about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Father was an endocrinologist, and he would have asexual patients who he would treat and give testosterone to. And often they'd come back and say, I don't want to do this. It just drives me crazy to be thinking about it all the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah. And of course, people, yeah, asexuality is another form of relationship to that part of life. So there's people who never really have a strong need or desire for that, but then it can change over time. What I think some people will have a lot of shame come up and retire, especially men, if they maybe even I've read studies about this and I'm not good at remembering all the statistics about it, but just some large percentage of men who maybe even after one episode of erectile dysfunction feel so much shame that they don't even come back around to try it again.
All right.
Yeah, just tremendous amount of shame.
I remember that my first sexual encounter, I couldn't perform. It was horrible. I
Mm,
just thought, what's wrong with me? There must be something really dreadfully wrong. And in retrospect, it was because my partner didn't help me out at all.
yeah. Mm,
But I remember how terribly
humiliating or
not only humiliated, but just felt there's something wrong with me.
yeah. This brings in, I know we're coming close to the end here, but maybe just the idea of the body and like the body has its own things going on with hormones and all the different complex systems that go into this. And then we have our psychological parts. And I don't know, it's an intricate relationship between the two. I'll just say that. And then people parts take on beliefs like I'm broken, which is a common burden people take on. And then the body will act more broken. Yeah.
Yeah, and my understanding is there's fewer and fewer kids having sex now,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also postmenopausal women, big shift too.
Yeah. I think we're in a time where so many people feel so disconnected, just experience so much isolation and disconnection. And we're so disconnected from nature in many ways, from the environment. Just there's so much going on that to me, it feels when we can befriend our bodies and befriend our sexuality and learn how to experience that in relation to other human beings, it just helps us feel more in touch with the web that the world wide web of life and maybe bring in some of that resilience and creativity that we need to like not just there's so much coming at us all the time that is not life affirming. And so I'm grateful again at the amazing gift that IFS has been and being able to help people with this.
Yeah. Thank you, Patty.
Yeah. So anything else you'd want to say before we close here today?
I think it is a fascinating arena for IFS therapists in particular to enter. And so I'm glad you're teaching it, encouraging people to go that direction.
Great. And one thing I like to ask people at the end is if you'd want to share something you find pleasurable, just in life, something enjoyable for you.
Be on podcast.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
I like sex, and I also
Mhm.
like tennis. I've been playing a lot of tennis lately.
Uh-huh. Cool. Yeah. Thank you. And I have a subgroup there, and I'm not a tennis player. Yeah, I just again appreciate your many contributions, and we'll have some things in the show notes for people that want to find their way to more resources about IFS.
Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.